horrifying details out of Israel as new reporting from the New York Times appears to confirm some of the most vile and reprehensible atrocities committed by Hamas against Israeli civilians on October 7th. Specifically, the Times seemed to confirm the reports of mass rape and sexual violence. A warning, some of the reporting is very graphic. The Times concluded their 2-month-long investigation with evidence based on interviews with 150 witnesses, medical personnel, soldiers, and rape counselors, alongside video footage, photographs, and GPS data. The Times alleges it viewed photographs of a woman's corpse with dozens of nails driven into her thighs and groin. Another video featured 2 dead Israeli soldiers at a base near Gaza who appear to have been shot directly in their vaginas. One survivor described how she saw another woman get, quote, shredded into pieces, while one terrorist raped her, she said. Another pulled out a box cutter and sliced off her breast.
The Times also featured a bit of the other side of the story with a report detailing how Israel dropped its most destructive weaponry in areas it had previously marked safe for Palestinian civilians at least 200 separate occasions. Here's some of that reporting.
This is an area in Gaza where for weeks civilians fled to find safety. These are 2,000-pound bombs, one of the most destructive munitions in Western military arsenals. When a 2,000-pound bomb detonates, it unleashes a blast wave and metal fragments thousands of feet in every direction. Sometimes, 2,000-pound bombs leave giant craters in the earth, like this strike in South Gaza in November.
The war in the region also continues to impact global shipping and commerce as Muslim Houthi rebels continue to attack international ships in the Red Sea. The U.S. has sent ships into the region to deal with the attacks. Reports indicate that the USS Mason intercepted a Houthi-launched drone, an anti-ship ballistic missile, in the southern Red Sea yesterday in what marked the 22nd attack by rebels on shipping in more than 2 months. So what's going on here? It's extremely sad to hear the level of destruction and the details of these reports. When I think about what the rebels are doing, I mean, Israel has the support of the U.S. military, Palestine does not. And so Yemen seems to be one of the only countries that is actually supporting Palestine on this side of the war. I think it's extremely strategic to attack the international shipping. We had protests here in the United States on the west and east coast where there were shipments of weapons leaving the U.S. to go to Israel. And there were protesters trying to block those weapons. I can see anyone interested in peace wanting to prevent weapons from getting in the hands of the people who are using them the most. Now, the New York Times reporting to me feels a little dishonest because the New York Times for the past, 50 years has not done a very good job detailing the sexual crimes of Israeli soldiers in occupied territory against Palestinians. The figures are 1 in 10 women in Gaza have experienced some kind of abuse from Israeli soldiers. And it's even higher in younger age women, where it's as high as 23% have experienced sexual abuse from Israeli soldiers in the occupied territory. You also had at the beginning of the war 4,500 Palestinians captured by Israelis. And now, just since the beginning of the war, in the occupied West Bank, where Hamas doesn't even operate, they have captured and arrested the exact same number, just over 4,500 Palestinians. And so, we don't really know what's happening in many cases to the Palestinians that are currently captured, but there's very well documented accounts of sexual abuse and violence by Israelis on Palestinians. And it feels like intentional propaganda when I read the New York Times and there's such detailed coverage of what are terrible things done to women in the region. But when the assailant is the Israeli military, it doesn't afford the same coverage. And I really feel like that's sowing a lot of discontent in the American people for Palestinians and for Hamas when we have so many years prior to October 7th where it hasn't been covered. And so it makes it very easy to make the case that what Israel is doing is in response to this gruesome attack on October 7th, when that's not when the violence began. And so I feel like it's important that that's said. But what's going on is horrible, and bombing safe zones is also just disgusting and horrible. 200 occasions. It's unimaginable.
Yeah, I would say in a rare instance, I'll actually praise the New York Times for its journalism on both of these stories. Clearly, they have actually done the investigative legwork to try to show what's happening on both sides of this conflict, when very early on, there were a lot of erroneous reports coming out from both sides. And I think that this piece about the sexual violence is not intended to be propaganda by any means, but it's intended to respond to a very specific discourse that's been happening in American media, where there have been denials from very high-profile journalists and members of the media that there was any systemic or systematic sexual violence done by Hamas on October 7th. So in response to that, the New York Times did what a responsible news outlet should do, which is they talked to the witnesses, they reviewed the medical records, they talked to the first responders on that day, and gathered as much material as they possibly could to try to tamp down the denial of what really happened on October 7th. So I don't view this as propaganda from the IDF, but as the New York Times doing its duty to try to inform the public of what actually happened, as there have been these conspiracy theories that all of the claims of rape and sexual assault were just done in order to justify what Israel was doing, when it was actually the reality of what those people faced.
Right. Yeah. The New York Times reported that they interviewed many people. They had firsthand accounts of witnesses. Of course, rape kits were not done. Many of the people who were allegedly raped were already buried. It is the case that at least for many Palestinian women who are Muslim, there's a bit of resistance to even report rapes. There's all sorts of reasons many women cite that they don't want to upset their husbands. They've already gone through the trauma. They don't want any, additional prodding and poking to bring back memories that are just terrible. And to give firsthand testimony, I can't even imagine what that would be like, especially in a time of war when you've probably lost friends and family. And so the New York Times in this reporting, as we said here, relied on a lot of GPS data, firsthand witnesses. It was not just reports from the Israeli military, but I think the New York Times will continue to get more concrete evidence than just the firsthand accounts that they said they got. And I think it's the reasonable thing to do. Initially in the first days of war after October 7th, it's a situation that's in flux. It's very hard, if not impossible, to confirm that everything you get reports of is actually based in fact and based in truth. But now that we're so many days into the war, we should be expecting more reporting like this that either affirms or corrects the narratives initially pushed. In the case of the Al-Shifa Hospital, I would like to see the New York Times, revisit their reporting on the Al-Shifa Hospital, given the context we have now from the independent investigations from BBC and the Washington Post. I think the media in the United States has a huge opportunity to rebuild trust with the American people and how they continue to report on the Israel-Palestine war as it continues. I think, just as someone who's read so many reports initially that were wrong, I lost a lot of faith in the days following October 7th. And reporting like this, I think, helps people restore their faith. The independent investigation from the Washington Post. But we also have stories like the 40 beheaded baby story that was initially pushed by Biden himself. Similarly, he said that they had intelligence and that it was absolutely certain that there was a command center in the Al-Shifa Hospital. So it's the media and it's the administration that pushed false narratives initially that were never confirmed. And correcting the record is extremely important, especially when you talk about 40 beheaded babies on October 7th, but you don't have widespread reporting on the fact that the Al-Shifa Hospital was not a command center, but 43 babies died in the NICU when Israeli forces decided to attack and raid that hospital. They shut off power and water and supplies to these hospitals, resulting in the deaths of many. And so sometimes the reporting is dangerous, and it gives this kind of consent for the United States to continue sending weapons when we have this belief that, oh my God, 40 babies were beheaded. We have this belief that this hospital has been turned into a terrorist command center. Of course, Israeli forces should raid it. And now the civilians living in Gaza have lost their most important hospital. It is the largest and highest functioning hospital. And I think, maybe all they need is that window of time of permission when the story is initially reported, and the damage is already done by the time the record's corrected. So they have an opportunity to rebuild trust by not just correcting the record, but also taking accountability for that.
Yeah, the reporter who was responsible, I think, for first spreading the 40 beheaded babies story misspoke, and what she meant to say was that it was 40 babies were killed, some of whom were beheaded, and that story just spread like wildfire because of the sensational aspect of it. That being said, there are so many other videos and audio evidence of what happened on October 7th that that alone seems like a sort of a minor quibble among the destruction that was wrought on that day. But I agree with you. I think the media needs to be careful when they're reporting in wartime. It seems quite frequently that these stories get out of hand and spread before they can be reasonably corrected. These things don't tend to be the corrections don't seem to be spread as widely as the initial story. We saw this in the Ukraine-Russia conflict as well, where there was this whole narrative about the ghost of Kyiv, who was somehow shooting down like hundreds of Russian fighter pilots or something or other, and it turned out not to be true. There was a story about, I think, a Ukrainian squadron that refused to surrender on some island, and that turned out not to be true. And so wartime reporting is very fraught with inaccuracy. And so I agree that I'm looking forward to seeing some better investigative reporting going forward and hopefully try to suss out the real damage of this conflict. Well, we're going to take a break and be back with more Rising after this.